Hi, I'm Elisa Barbour. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at ITS, working with Susan Handy for a couple of years now, after I graduated from UC Berkeley with a PhD in city planning. And I'm going to be talking about a current project of mine called Planning and Policymaking for Transit-Oriented Development, or TOD, Transit and Active Transport in California Cities. So a few project basics. This is a 2-year Caltrans funded project through NCST with a whole team of collaborators, including Susan. The goal is to determine motivations, perceived obstacles, and major policy plans and programs that California cities are adopting to support TOD, Transit and Active Transport, or AT. We want to consider how and whether state and regional programs support local efforts, and how patterns of TOD policymaking vary based on city characteristics for the built environment, demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, and political leanings. And the main research methods are an online survey and case study analysis. We completed the survey of city planning directors in the state's 4 largest metro areas last spring, and we are still undergoing case study research until this December. Now I'll say a little bit about the policy context for our project. Numerous state policies and programs support TOD, Transit, and AT in order to help promote our climate and sustainability goals. And so, of course, that includes AB and SB 32, which establish our state's greenhouse gas reduction goals and which have been translated into many implementation measures, including SB 375, which is our regional planning law to promote efficient transportation and land use. And that calls on regional transportation planning agencies to reduce VMT through coordinated planning with localities. And then finally, I'll mention SB 743, adopted in 2013, which reorients how we conduct environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act for development projects. Now, localities also support TOD, not just the state government, for reasons including downtown revitalization, workforce housing, and mobility and accessibility improvements. However, many obstacles to TOD remain, and the Air Resources Board, which oversees implementation of SB 375, recently determined that that law is not achieving its goals because development patterns are running counter to doing so. And ARB has expressed concern that localities are not doing enough to support infill and TOD. Meanwhile, we've also seen some intense controversy erupt over state legislative efforts to support infill, particularly over passage of one bill, SB 50, which would have mandated upzoning near transit for certain projects. So this is an important time to evaluate local policymaking to support TOD, and that's what our project does. So now I'll say a little bit about surveys, results, and data measures. So our online survey conducted last spring achieved a 44% response rate from city planning directors in the 4 largest metro areas. And our respondent cities are roughly representative in the 4 regions on key characteristics of interest that we measured, including regional location, city access to high quality transit areas, activity density, population size, racial ethnic makeup, median income, and political leanings. And these are the variables that we used in conjunction with survey results to analyze patterns. Now some survey findings. 2/3 of respondent cities indicate they have adopted policies, programs, and plans to support TOD, and nearly as high a share to support transit. We found substantial complexity in the results in terms of motivations, perceived barriers, and policy choices Few characteristics of cities prove to be simple or consistent explanatory factors. We asked about motivations for adopting TOD policies, and the motivation rated very important by survey respondents most often for their city's elected leaders in adopting TOD policies and programs is to improve community revitalization and livability. And that was followed closely by improving mobility and accessibility, and then providing housing, both affordable housing and housing more generally. And I want to focus on that second factor, the high share of cities that rank mobility and accessibility as an important motivation. A primary underlying concern for our project is whether and how localities connect transportation to land use planning. And in that regard, this is a significant finding because it shows that many local elected leaders are indeed making the transportation land use connection that we're investigating. They're aware of the strong interconnection between land use and travel behavior. We conducted regression analysis to determine what city characteristics might be associated with cities ranking mobility accessibility as very important. And we found that democratic voter share and racial ethnic diversity were significant predictors after controlling for all of those variables that we measured. Now, 3 other TOD motivations were also significantly associated with liberal political leanings of city residents, namely the motivation to promote housing growth, affordable housing, and environmental benefits. We found housing growth was associated with a few other factors, but noticeably not with a city's job housing balance. And that was worth noting because it means job-rich cities do not feel more pressure than others to increase housing. We also asked survey takers about their perceived obstacles to TOD, and the factor cited most frequently as a major obstacle was lack of vacant land, followed by difficulty in assembling land parcels, inadequate frequency of transit service, inadequate transit facilities, and then resident concerns or opposition. Now, difficulty assembling land parcels has been a problem for California cities, especially since the dissolution in 2012 of Redevelopment Authority, the main means by which cities had been revitalizing downtown areas as well as producing affordable housing. Now, we've had some restoration of redevelopment tax increment authority since 2012, but much more limited than the lost powers. Note also in this ranking that 2 factors considered critical for TOD success, but which are out of the direct control of city officials, namely resident opposition and lack of market interests, were rated less significant as obstacles than factors which are more directly under the control of policymakers, in particular transit infrastructure and service, and difficulty assembling land parcels. We measured overall motivation to try to find out what characteristics of cities are associated with higher motivation for TOD policymaking. So we simply added up the number of motivations considered very important to each survey respondent. And we found an interesting pattern in which higher overall motivation across multiple TOD goals was associated with lower perception of obstacles and also with liberal political leanings among city residents. This reinforces a thread in our findings of an association between political ideology and TOD motivation. Moving on, we investigated policy adoption. We presented a list of 22 regulatory, planning, affordable housing, and finance measures and asked whether each city had adopted them. The most frequently reported strategy used by cities to promote TOD is offering density bonuses, which are required by California's density bonus law. Other popular strategies include mixed-use zoning, development of specific plans, which are neighborhood scale plans, reduced parking requirements, and upzoning for development near transit, followed by strategies to streamline environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act. More than half of cities with adopted TOD policies and programs employ these strategies. We also investigated overall policy adoption rates by simply summing up the number of measures adopted by each city, and then investigating what characteristics are associated with adoption rates. We found only that city population size, location in the LA metro area, which was negatively associated with adoption rates, and market interests were significant predictors. Now, we also asked survey respondents how important they considered each policy to be for achieving their city's TOD goals if they had adopted the policy. Respondents said that zoning policies are considered most important, both for mixed use zoning and upzoning, followed by adoption of specific plans, and then CEQA streamlining from specific plans. These findings underscore the importance of local regulation, specifically zoning, connected to local plan making and environmental review. We put together the information on the rates of policy adoption with the perceived importance that respondents rank different measures, again, for cities that have adopted the policies. And when we compare these two measures about importance as well as adoption rates, we get an indication of which policies are considered highly influential, but which may also be hard to adopt. And this discrepancy is evident here in the slide for upzoning, for permit streamlining, for subsidies for affordable housing, for pedestrian bicycle overlay zones, parking pricing, and transportation development impact fees that are lowered near transit among the measures that we evaluated. Moving on to our case study analysis, it's underway still, and we're investigating city strategies using online documents and interviews. Now, we have focused on two groups of cities. First, the central cities in the 4 major regions. And second, a strategic sample that we culled from our survey results. For cities that meet these criteria, they have high motivation for TOD policymaking, especially for mobility, accessibility, and affordable housing goals. They have adopted policies that respondents deem to be highly important and influential, namely upzoning, mixed-use zoning, permit streamlining, and impact fees that vary based on transit proximity. And they intend to revise their city's transportation impact fee pursuant to SB 743, because we did ask questions about 743 compliance. Again, that's the new law that requires environmental review to focus on reducing VMT rather than alleviating traffic congestion. And some lessons learned from the entire project so far. TOD transit policymaking is widespread. However, patterns are very complex in understanding which cities are pursuing what types of policies. Many cities are making the transportation land use connection. For example, we found that a city's propensity to upzone is linked to rating mobility and accessibility as a very important motivation. Our case studies, however, also indicate that there are trade-offs cities face in addressing accessibility, mobility through land use. For example, some strategies that can enhance accessibility, such as by improving transit and active transport, don't always improve traffic congestion. And so that's a challenge cities face, is balancing those trade-offs. Our case studies also indicate that many cities are seeking to support TOD mainly along targeted transit corridors, but they're also leaving many single-family neighborhoods alone. This constitutes a political compromise that can help allay fears about densification in cities. However, this also has the consequence that controversies over how to balance affordable housing with upzoning for new upscale development, how to balance concerns about alleviating traffic congestion with mode shifting strategies. These controversies get concentrated into TOD zones, which can make TOD policymaking all the more challenging. And so I'll leave it there and thank you for your attention.